Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammāṃ Saṅghāṃ Namasami. So 2 weeks ago, I spoke about the 5 khandhas, what we call the aggregates in Buddhism, which are the form aggregate, which is the body, feeling, pleasant, painful, neutral, perception, sankhara, which is translated as formations, which is something that needs a bit of unpacking. Some translated as programs, and consciousness, vijnana. And the word khandha, or aggregate, means heap or mass. And in the Buddhist conception, it can have the connotation of not just a weight that we carry, a mass that we carry, something we attach to, but also a heap of flame, focal point of identity to which we cling. Someone once asked Ajahn Nisabho what the Buddhist Pali word for experience is. And Ajahn Nisabho responded by saying that we don't have exactly that word. The word for experience in Buddhism is khandha. These 5 khandhas are experience. They are what can constitute our experience. The issue comes when we take them as a self, when we attach to them and try to take refuge in them. And the difficulty is each of these rises and passes away, as all experience does. They are transitory. And when we seek refuge in them, then when they break and decay, then our heart breaks as well. Ajahn Sona says it's like we are constantly reaching into water and wishing it were a solid. We're constantly trying to make a liquid a solid. And one useful way of looking at the whole Buddhist path is that it's a replacement of the energy of fire, agitated, clinging, bound to its fuel, with the energy of light, cool, radiant, all-pervasive, still. And this distinction, I think, is nowhere better displayed than in the third of the Buddha's seminal discourses, the Adita Parya Suta, which I spoke of briefly 2 weeks ago, where the Buddha takes a contingent of contemplatives known as fire worshippers, and before the Buddha, the spiritual metric which practitioners used was the accumulation of something called tapas, which was spiritual heat. And you would gather this through ascetic practice and meditation. It was good. And so the Buddha takes, with unbelievable skill, this conception and turns it completely upside down. He takes these fire worshippers who were very bound to a place. They usually made their sacred fires in a valley by a river. So he takes them up to a place called Gaya Sise, which was a hill. And he points to a wildfire in the distance, using what was in the environment as a skillful means of teaching. And then he changes every perception, or their most tightly held perception of fire as something to be cultivated, and says, no, the eye is burning, forms are burning, the ear is burning, sound is burning, the tongue is burning, taste is burning, and so on through the sense bases. Burning with what? Burning with the flames of fire, or the flames of greed, hatred, and delusion. And then he goes on to speak about the path to awakening. And Ajahn Kovilo recently asked Bhikkhu Bodhi how he translated Buddha, as the awakened one or the enlightened one. And the verb stem from which Buddha comes, buj, is in some ways most literally translated as awakening. And yet the Bhikkhu Bodhi translates it as enlightenment, because all the imagery in the suttas, or much of it, has to do with light. Light arises, and the Buddha compares the higher stages of consciousness to light that lands on nothing. Consciousness without surface. When he speaks about the mind, he says, the chitta is inherently radiant. The chitta is the heart. Kilesas, the defilements, are just visitors. So this path is about shedding the energy of agitated heat bound to one spot for this radiant, cool energy. And also lightening the heaviness of this load that we take by attaching to these khandhas, these aggregates. And in a sense, our suffering can be seen as this flame. We cling, as a flame does to a log, to each of these 5 aggregates through our attachment and identification with them, and we are bound to them. So much of the path involves releasing our grip just a little bit on these aggregates, realizing that they are not a substantive and reliable focal point for our identities, and using them in the service of the path towards a refuge beyond what is changeable and slipping through our fingers constantly. Ajahn Jeff compares it to the process of taking 5 burdens of bricks, which we carry on our backs, and laying them down and making a road and a pathway from them. So 2 weeks ago, I spoke about the body, the first of these 2, the body and feeling. And in a sutta, the Buddha gives analogies for each of the khandhas. He says, form is like a lump of foam. It appears solid. This is my own explanation of it. It appears solid, but when you look closely, it's composed of countless tiny parts and bubbles and dissolves. Feeling is the ripple on water left by a raindrop. And you can think of the depth of that image in that when we're impacted by a perception, by a contact with any experience, that's the raindrop. And the ripple outward, that's the feeling. Pain, pleasant, neither painful nor pleasant. Perception, the third khandha, the Buddha says, is like a mirage. So, how do we take the mirage and stop trying to drink from water that is not there? If anyone's driven along the highway and seen the glistening on the pavement in front of you, always just out of reach, that's a mirage. How do we stop trying to taste that and somehow turn it into a service and a piece of our path? There's a wonderful analogy that one teacher gives about the constituents of mental experience, which are called nama, as in nama rupa, mentality and materiality, which are the whole of the Buddhist conception of what composes experience, another model. The Buddha divides the pie in many different ways in different suttas. And nama is composed of feeling, which is compared to the pinky in this analogy. It's delicate, sensitive. To perception, which is what we're talking about, which is the signet finger, the ring finger. Because when a perception arises, you're bound to something. It solidifies and crystallizes your perception of someone or something or some experience. So your boss walks in the door and immediately the term enemy rises in your heart, or maybe friend. And your body tenses up in response or relaxes. And this nearly subverbal and subconscious impact of perception is deeply powerful. It's the names we apply right when we see something or hear it. The middle finger is intention. It's the largest finger, and in most cultures, the middle finger is used to point. In our culture, it's used for various other things, which might have its own sort of symbolism. And the pointer finger is contact. The thumb is attention, manas. And all five of these can grasp objects together and press them into the heart, which is the palm, chitta. In deep states of concentration, there's no object, but rather attention turns and holds all mental constituents together into the chitta in one unified place without an object, the mind resting in itself. What's significant in this analogy for our purposes of the third khanda, perception, is the fact that it's the ring finger. Perception marries us and crystallizes our world. There's a sutta called the Madhupindika Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 18, where the Buddha runs through how we create suffering through proliferation. He says, based on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. Based on contact, one feels. Feeling arises. What one feels, one perceives. No, feeling arises. Yes, what one feels, one perceives. And what's interesting there is that the first person pronoun, what one feels, one perceives, arises right in conjunction with perception. Up until then, it's impersonal. There's I and forms, contact, and feeling just arising. But as soon as perception comes into play, then our whole world of subject and object, of how we are relating to the object of our perception, crystallizes. And this is to say that the self and our conception of ourself as a charged entity, we exist because we're pushing away from something or pulling towards something. And our sense of self is stronger or weaker based on the strength of that charge. So as soon as we perceive someone and see them as an enemy, a friend, then our whole being and self in the situation crystallizes around that. So how do we marry ourselves to the path and not to a reactive perception of something that does not deserve us and our deepest aspirations? Choosing your spouse is important. And outside of meditation, the Buddha provides an enormous number of tools for affecting our perception of things. In fact, much of the Buddhist path and the teachings are just that. So many of the tools he gives for developing loving kindness, like the chants that we just did, is developing a bright and caring perception that we can bring and that will pervade all our other perceptions and soften the more angular edges and aversive ones we hold towards those in our lives. Similarly, there's a lot of skillful means we can use. One I've mentioned again and again because it's the most helpful I've ever found is when dealing with anger, to look at a difficult person not as a problem or an annoyance, but rather as our teacher. And I tell the story of living in a monastery with a monk who would admonish me for everything. And as long as he was just that guy talking to me again, then it was an annoyance. But as soon as I realized that if he had been a senior teacher telling me these same points of refinement, I would have taken it as a great gift and a training. So why didn't I just take him as the teacher? Then he became my largest teacher that entire year. And I learned a great deal. And the Mahayana have a concept that the bodhisattvas can send down incarnations of themselves as the drunk down the street, or as a difficult friend or enemy to train you. So can that person in your life be your teacher and be a bodhisattva sent to teach you patience and care? And this is just a simple switch in perception, but it can make all the difference. A basic tenet of cognitive behavioral therapy is that a stressor approached voluntarily is curative, whereas a stressor run from or approached involuntarily initiates the limbic system's response. And I think we can look at this as the difficulty we have as human beings, in that whereas most animals fall clearly into prey or predator, we have for most of our evolutionary history been stuck between the two. We are both prey and predator. We hunt and are hunted. So this means we have two very different circuitries in the brain. Either we're being hunted and running, or we're hunting. And in some ways, much of this path can be looked at as just changing one for the other. Because the First Noble Truth's essence is seeing how most of our lives is taken up by running from our suffering. We are prey to it. We are constantly fleeing and trying to escape. And we turn towards it, and suddenly we see suffering in our lives not as something to be avoided, because we cannot avoid it. We will sicken, we will die, we will lose everyone we love. So how do we turn towards it and understand it and lay careful palms on its shape, so we understand it as one more tool that can bring us closer to compassion for all beings? How do we understand it as a pathway towards feeling and embodying our own fragility, and understanding that in that lies our greatest strength and humanity? This is why the whole fulcrum of the Buddhist teachings is around dukkha, suffering. It doesn't sound romantic, but it's always there. You can always touch it. And if you manage to move through it, to approach it carefully, then it opens into grace and the other three truths of peace, of enlightenment, of the path. This is a shift in perception. There's a story of Chogyam Trungpa entering a monastery in Tibet, and these monasteries were guarded by gigantic Tibetan mastiffs, and he was with an entourage of senior lamas. And the Tibetan mastiff in one of these monasteries broke its chain and ran at the whole entourage, and everyone scattered, except for Chogyam Trungpa, who decided to run straight at the mastiff, and it got so frightened it turned and ran away. And this is what we do with suffering, is we turn towards it. Similarly, there's a teacher who was giving a talk in Sandpoint, Idaho, about the Four Noble Truths. And when he talked about the first noble truth, one person piped up and said, "It's like telephone poles." And he said, "What do you mean?" And the student said, "I used to work installing telephone poles." And the foreman asked, "If this falls, which way do you run?" And he said, you run away. And the foreman said, "No, you run straight to it and put your hands on it." The closest and safest place to be is right next to it so you can feel which way it moves. And this is what we do with our suffering too. Longpor Liam says that there are no obstacles in practice, only worthy adversaries. So, and another famous teacher, Han Shan, says that this path becomes all pleasurable because when things are good, they're good. And when things are hard, it's a chance to use your Dharma strength, which is also pleasurable. So it's all good. And I think we feel this is there's a real joy when we can stop seeing our lives as this run towards pleasure and away from pain, and instead see the whole thing as an opportunity for a practice and to shape ourselves into something better. It's the most massive and significant shift in perception of a life, because those are two completely different ways of existing in the world. In one, we are prey and victim to the vicissitudes of life, and we are either running or distracting ourselves or fracturing ourselves or losing ourselves and our purpose in a confluence of comfort. Or we understand that we will not find a way to run. You can never escape what is hunting you. What you can do is you can turn towards it and change your perception of it into a teacher and move towards that stressor and see it as a path towards greater purpose. So this is a shift in perception. This is how we take this mirage and stop trying to drink from it and instead see in its reflection the image of the sky, even laid out on the pavement in front of us. An image of something much more powerful that we can move towards. That's the mirage used correctly. In meditation, it can be a bit simpler. Much of the path, if you look at the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, is each subsequent step involves shedding a impermanent and more coarse perception for a more refined and permanent one. So the first steps of the sutta deal with breathing in and out and knowing that in-breath and out-breath. And Bhante Analayo compares this to a condor flapping its wings. It's impermanent, it's based in the body, it moves a great deal. You move from that to holding the whole field of the body in awareness, trying to keep awareness broad, which Bhante Analayo compares to a condor soaring without flapping its wings. And this perception is refined, it's stable. From there, you become sensitive to the rapture in the body, refreshment, this sense of the breath energy coursing along the meridians, up the spine, down the front of the body. And that eventually leads to a sense of sukha, pleasure, which is a stable sense of feeling full and bright. And that's very still. At that step, frequently the perception of light comes into awareness. And people miss it because they expect it to manifest as a sort of orb of light. But frequently it's just a whole sense of brightening of the visual field. Or if you've practiced with the nada sound, the sound of silence, which is a subtle hissing right below the auditory field, which is always there. And if you attune to it, you can make it grow in your awareness until it's perceptible throughout your entire life. Ajahn Amro can hear it over power tools. Longpur Sumedho says that it's all that got him through the number of board meetings he had to sit through at the beginning of Amravati. He didn't say it's all that got him through it, but I think it had something to do with helping him through it. And it's a very stable object. So the breath is still there throughout the Anapanasati Sutta, but it's in the background. And more you're foregrounding these perceptions of stable, constant, consistent objects. And this leads to a mind state and a mind and a heart that is stable and consistent too. It's flavored by its object. Ajahn Mahabua says that this entire path is about us challenging the Buddha. The Buddha says that all things are impermanent, so we try to cultivate a mind state that is as stable and lasting as we can. The Buddha says that all things are tied to stress and suffering. So we try to develop a mind and a heart and mind states that are as bright and radiant as possible. The Buddha says that all things are not under our control, not self. So we try to cultivate a mind state and a mind that we can direct perfectly. And only after we've pushed samsara to its limits, after we've developed this perception and this mind that is as stable and bright and malleable as possible. After we've cornered ourselves, only then can the jump be made by the heart into the unconditioned, into something beyond all samsara. So as we climb this ladder of practice, each subsequent rung upwards is a new and more stable perception in meditation and in life in general. And the Buddha gave many skillful means for this, other than just the breath meditation. The sutras are filled with imagery, and the Buddha was a poet as much as a mechanic of the mind. When he walks us through the stages of jhana, he gives analogies of one, in the first jhana, kneading water into a ball of bath powder. And even so, one pervades and permeates this body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. And the second jhana he compares to a cool mountain lake, fed by springs. The third jhana to red, white, and blue lotuses immersed in a pond of cool water, so that no part of their stems or tips were unpervaded by that water. And you'll notice that in that image, whereas the previous two had motion, there's no motion. Everything is still. It's a stable perception. And it's also a catalyst for the mind to transition into these states of concentration. It's poetry. The one other significant thing to mention is the Buddha in the Aranya Vibhanga Sutta speaks about how one avoids conflict by not speaking in terms of individuals, but in terms of states. So one doesn't say one who engages in this or that suffers. Rather, one says, and this is in the suttas, it's another moment of just profound wisdom. One says, rather, the state of being attached to blank is a state beset with suffering. And much of this path, apart from meditation and in meditation, is about breaking down our usual perceptions, which are clumsy and large and bound with suffering. So when the person across the table from you is that guy with the name and the history that you've attached to them and all the difficulties you've had, and especially if they're the opposite political party, then there are those people as well. And it's like a ball of lint gathering mass until it's just one impermeable, ugly ball of something you really don't want to get near. But if you think rather of that person more and more as a set of discrete states of qualities, of goodness, of bad, of defilement, of potential, of history, then suddenly all that perception and that charge breaks down, and you can see them as just a human being. And this, I think, is why Ajahn Nisabho so often recommends looking at the mind as a committee. You have your good voices and your bad voices. And then when a mental state comes up that is not skillful, it's not you who are once again that guilty, flawed person you've always been. It's just that one committee member is piping in again, like he always does, and it's just one of many. And you can acknowledge that. And it also gives you the chance to discern how you interact with people at a more refined level. Because if you just perceive people as individual entities, then if your friend who wants to call you and gossip or vent or wallow in their own difficulties with you, again, even though you know it leads nowhere, say, then you're left with the choice of either withdrawing, and you might see that as being unkind, or in giving in and gossiping with them, or listening to one more diatribe about this or that. But if you perceive them instead as a mass of different states, of warring factions, of gods, of something divine, of angels and animals, then you can see very clearly what part of that person are you feeding? What part are you being a friend to? And if you are, in fact, being a friend to and supporting and listening to the animal side again, or the part of them which you know is not thinking of their best interest, then you aren't really helping them by doing so. And then you can still steer very skillfully towards helping and befriending the skillful parts of them. Or if you need to withdraw a little bit, you don't have to see it as hurting them or distancing yourself from them. Rather, you're no longer supporting the state in them which will lead to their own pain. And this is no small shift. Most monastics, when we leave home, have to speak with those who feel that they're losing us. and don't understand. My grandma was very confused about me going off to Thailand, but she was nice enough to always say she thought it was very brave, so that was nice, but that I was a very handsome young man, and I think the implication there was that was a shame that I was taking the robes or something. My grandmother was fairly biased in this regard. And there's a feeling that the more you pull away from those you love by taking a step away into a monastery, or even in our lives, just by pulling away a little bit from those who aren't walking this path in the same way we are, you're hurting them. You're withdrawing your friendship. And what's so helpful about stopping this perception of those around you as simple individuals, and rather looking at them as a conglomeration of good and bad and everything in between, is that you can see that you may be withdrawing from some part of them. But at the same time, by taking a clear and dedicated step on this path, you're befriending the deepest and most important part of them, the part that wants and needs and moves towards awakening. People in your life do not need one more person to go to the movies with, or go to Starbucks with, or gossip to. But someday, when cancer strikes, or a loved one dies, or the addiction resurfaces, they may very much need someone in their life who's been an example of what it means to walk with dedication towards a worthy and transcendent goal. So even though it can feel like you're taking a step away from them, when you leave the dinner party early, when you say, I'm sorry, I don't feel like going out tonight, I actually want to stay in and practice, even though it feels like you're taking a step away from them, if they are conceived of instead as a mixture of angels and animals, humans, different mind states, then you can see that actually you're taking a great step towards the brightest part of them and a large step away from the darkest part. And that's the biggest and greatest gift of love you can give them. And they may not understand it in the moment. So this is how we change our perception that we marry ourselves to, both in terms of the world and our meditation, and those we love, and ourselves and our suffering. And the mirage, which we constantly run towards and try to drink from, even as it flees in front of us, becomes instead something we can look to and see a reflection of a broad and bright expanse of the mind and heart's potential. Because if you think of the mirage on the freeway, that really is what it is. It's a reflection of something much greater. And we can marry ourselves to a world and a vision of ourselves and of those around us that is truly worthy. And that's something worth marrying ourselves to. So I thought we'd get through the other three today, but that's just one more. So we'll just keep on going on this schedule.
Towards those people that have been difficult for me, saying, oh, what a wonderful teacher. Please teach me more. I was sort of wondering what your perspective is on this monk. Has he become a great friend, or is he someone that you would still sort of like, okay, he was like a good teacher for a period of time, but I'm not seeking him out for further teachings?
Great question. Yeah, I think there's a story of the first teacher who took Buddhism to Tibet, and he'd heard that all the Tibetans were really nice, so he took his annoying chaiwala with him so that he'd had someone to practice with. But I don't think we have to do that. That's taking things to a bit of extremes. I'd say we have enough suffering as it is without kind of intentionally tying ourselves to more difficult things. I think this is a helpful recollection for those in your life that you are with, one way or the other, and there is always someone, I think, for most of us, and even if it's just yourself.
We're always being another teacher.
Yeah, but that transition from looking at them as an enemy to a great friend really can just change everything. And I did come away as a very good friend with this monk, and I felt like my karma had been honored. And I think, the part I leave out is like, we actually had to have a lot of hard talks, but the Buddha's rules around when you can speak with people were very helpful. So as monks, we can't admonish another monk unless, I've mentioned this before, unless we ask for permission and get permission, unless we have genuine goodwill in our hearts, unless it's the right time. We have to speak honestly, and I believe we have to speak in a way connected with the goal, or be free from fault ourselves. I think there's two separate lists. So, that really constrained me because I couldn't lash out, and that was really helpful, So I actually had to wait for those times when, Ajahn Amaro has a story of having to wait a whole year before he had enough meant in his heart to actually talk to the other monk that he needed to speak to. I didn't wait that long, but, pretty regularly I actually had to sit down with this monk and actually, we parsed some stuff out, and we realized we were never going to be, friends in that way, but we were going to be brothers. Because you're brother, you push each other, but you're also really close, and you recognize the value, and that was a helpful shift, and I gave a lot of gifts to him as well to try to keep my heart really open, so it was a very, very powerful teaching, but I don't think you have to seek those things out, and I still regularly, not too regularly, but every now and again, about once a year, I reach out and try to send him an article or two that I found, it felt like that karma had been honored. I think we can sometimes think with our Judeo-Christian upbringing that, for most of us at least in our culture, that karma is this punishment. I think it's much more useful to think of as, it really is like you've done something to another. And so this is the world showing you what it felt like so you can learn to never do that again. And it's a lesson every time. So really honoring that karma in the best way, I felt like, And so often silence is the right, usually if you restrain the lashing out, then you can find the right moment for an actual discussion if it needs to happen. So, but I don't think you need to seek those people out. There's plenty around.
Letting the part of self go that perceives the fault or maintains the fault.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's, it points to that paradox in Buddhist practice where we always straddle two forms of right view. There's right view, which is called mundane right view, which is there is mother and father, there's the results of good and bad actions, there's what is given, and all those things have to do with the conventional world we live in. Like mother and father is pointing to our duties towards those around us. The result of good and bad action is, really paying careful attention to our actions' effects on everything. And then there's transcendent right view, which is the Four Noble Truths, and just that. And that's seeing everything just in terms of the dukkha, letting it go, and transcending it. And frequently when we speak about, this sort of being with someone and taking it as a practice, it has that flavor of transcendent right view. You're using the relationship as a microcosm for all your suffering. You know, you're seeing how suffering manifests, you're seeing the self come up and rise, and your aversion, and then you're letting it go again and again and again and again. And fair enough, it's useful, but it can become spiritual bypass if you don't also acknowledge, like, we do have one foot in this world where we have to navigate relationship, and you need to have those conversations, and sometimes you need to pay attention to the fault and address it directly. And exactly how you do that and how you decide when is appropriate time for each. I'd say there's a lot to be said for just, I think the ordering of the Four Noble Truths is significant in that, you know, first there's the noble truth of suffering, of looking at our suffering, letting go of the cause, realizing peace, and then developing the path. And so often I think they can be laid out like that because only when we realize peace from that place of stability can you see clearly the path forward. So I think it's a good litmus test because with that difficult relationship, any moment there's charge to that, there's still the aversion, it's not the time to have the conversation. Like, people sense if there's even a tad of anger in there, it changes everything. It's like the whole heart's orientation is shifted, as is the conversation, and the reaction will be shifted accordingly. So, and it's one of the conditions of admonishment, again, is like we actually have to have goodwill. So I think there's a lot to be said for like coming to those moments in meditation or the day where you really feel like the fire is completely cooled and you're able to look at things very clearly. And then you can hear the voice that says you need to have that conversation. You know, it's time, like enough is enough. And Ajahn Ambrose points to the fact that like you can usually hear the voice of Mara in your head versus the voice of the Buddha. These are used kind of tongue-in-cheek, but like Mara's voice is oily and it wants you to do something, but the Buddha's voice is very calm and knowledgeable, even if it's saying something like, you need to tell this guy to stop, you know, or you need to get out now. But it has a totally different feel, and I think it's helpful to listen to the tone of voice of what's telling you to have the conversation. Because if it's the Buddha's voice, quote unquote, it'll be clear, I think. And then for me, I just find there's also something where over time, a certain personal dynamic begins to crust into something more than just passing interactions, where I really feel it affecting me. You know, like you begin to really become say someone treats you like a child again and again, like you feel how that begins to crust into you really feeling like that, and it begins to affect and weigh on your heart in a way that's not healthy and not okay. And for me, it's like when the interactions stop being these individual interactions that I can navigate one by one and begin to crust into this web that covers over something real in me, then it's time to talk, you know. Does that help at all?